What I really want to say is I am asked many times, what is Jane really like? Right? This is a common question. And the subtext is she really so saintly as she seems? Now, some things about her are predictable. The love of animals that is mentioned in her own autobiographical writings and also in Peterson's big biography certainly applied to Gombe because in addition to the subjects of study, like the chimpanzees and the baboons and the colobus, we had Minnie, the gender-challenged mongoose. We had Crescent, the best-fed genet there ever was. We had Stumptail, the highwayman olive baboon, and so on, all parts of our daily lives. Jane has many talents which have not been revealed in the scientific literature. At one time, and I suspect still, she has extraordinary prehensile toes. I remember you picking up various objects in the mess and demonstrating this ability. I remember that you were a maker of very tasty sherry trifles, heavy on the sherry and tasty accordingly. But one thing came to mind. Someone told me recently, Jane, that you had been interviewed on television by a young woman who asked you if you were a bit flirtatious. And apparently you said that you were. And I don't know what that means, but I thought it did remind me of a story. When the Canadian High Commissioner came to visit Gombe, Mr. Barker, take note of that surname, Mr. Barker. Now, this needs a bit of background information. In those days, with such a demand for Gombe, I mean, there were many people who wanted to come, and Jane was always saying yes and add one more person. Gombe constantly needed new resources, new equipment, new accommodation, new facilities. And sometimes when visitors came, if they had a good time, they would feel inclined to write a check, maybe help out a bit, or to show their generosity in some other manner. So I do remember this evening when Jane somehow ended up sitting on Mr. Barker's knee in the mess, and she said something like, "This is so much fun, we're having such a good time, and from now on I'm going to call you Woof Woof." Get it? Mr. Barker, Woof Woof, and he just beamed. I mean, he just beamed. And sure enough, not long after that, down the lake in a water taxi came a great big load of furniture, which ended up in the mess. So with that parting image, I will yield the stage now to our fourth panelist, the person who has led more pant-hoot choruses than anyone else in history, I am sure. The dame with the name and the fame, who the apes did tame. Always game, shows no shame, and is blessedly, after 50 years, still the same. Jane Goodall.
Well, thank you, Bill. Do you remember why I called him Woof Woof?
The Barker connotation.
Oh, the Barker, yes. I'd forgotten that story. Thank you for it. Well, let's do a little more reminiscing. As you can perhaps imagine, when I was there at Gombe last July on the 14th, and I spent quite a bit of time by myself, and I was reminiscing. I was thinking about what's happened since that first day in July 1960. And of course, one of the things quite clearly is that so many of the people, both human and animal, that were around at that time were no longer around. And I thought a lot about the role of my mother. When I was a little girl growing up in England to a family with very little money, I always loved animals. Lots of little girls love animals, little boys too, as a matter of fact. And I had this very wise mother. I attribute so much of any success I've had in my life to the wise way that she raised me and my sister. And when she came to my room one day when I was 1.5 years old and found that I'd taken a whole handful of earthworms to bed with me, instead of saying, ugh, throw them out, they're dirty, she just said very quietly, Jane, if you leave them here, they're going to die. They need the earth. And so together, we took them back into the garden. And then I know some of you know this story, but it really does express the wisdom that she had. And this was, we went for a holiday to stay with some people on a farm, and I was 4.5 years old. We lived in London, so this was really exciting. Can you imagine for a little girl loving animals, coming from London, we had a dog and there were obviously some sparrows and pigeons and things like that, but now cows and pigs and horses. And I was given a job. I had to help collect the hens' eggs. Well, in those days, there were no cruel battery farms. The hens pecked around in the farmyard. They were supposed to lay their eggs in these little hen houses where they also slept at night, but very often we'd have to hunt around in the hedgerows to find the eggs. But each day I was collecting some eggs from the hen houses, putting them in my basket. And I don't remember this, but apparently I was going up to everyone and saying, but where does the egg come out of the hen? I couldn't see a hole that size. And obviously nobody answered to my satisfaction. So this is what I do remember, and it's extraordinary what you can remember from the time when you were a child, particularly if something happens to trigger that memory. And I saw a hen, and she was going up this little plank, which was then closed at night to keep the hens safe from the foxes. And I thought, oh, she's going to lay an egg. So I crawled in after her. Well, I mean, this was a big mistake. It was not the sort of thing the hen expected to happen. And with squawks of, I suppose, fear, she flew out. And I remember so distinctly thinking, if I stay here, no hen will come in because this is a frightening place. This is a little 4.5-year-old girl. So I climbed into an empty hen house. I'm obviously now on the trail of something, and I'm not going to give up. So I go into an empty hen house, and I waited. I don't remember how long I waited, but the family do, because they didn't know where I was. And they were frantic. They even called the police. And my mother said it was at least 4 hours that I was gone. And dusk is falling, and you can imagine how scared she must have been with everybody searching, the police on their way. She sees this little girl covered in straw rushing towards the house. How many mothers would just, out of sheer, nervous tension, seize that child and say, don't you ever do this again. Don't you know how worried we've been? Which, of course, would have killed the excitement. But she saw my shining eyes and sat down to hear this story of how a hen lays an egg. It was, if you look back on it, that was the making of a little scientist, the curiosity, asking the questions, not getting the right answer, deciding you will have to find out for yourself, doing it wrong, not giving up, and learning patience. So I think I came into my study of animal behavior just like Robert, through birds, but a different kind of bird and in a different kind of way. At any rate, one thing led to another. And again, my mother showed her wisdom. She found the books that she thought I would be interested in, and then she thought Jane will learn to read faster. Well, of course, she was absolutely right. And I can still remember Dr. Dolittle. I wanted to learn animal language. I begged my family for a parrot so that I could be taught like he was taught by Polynesia. And of course, we couldn't afford a parrot. Anyway, we shouldn't have parrots, but I didn't know that then. And so for a long time, I pretended that I could understand the animals, and I translated them to my friends. They believed me. They believed what the squirrels and the cats and the dogs were saying because I told them. Well, then I found the books about Tarzan. And I think, I can't remember, Richard or Bill, one of you mentioned the fact that there were no modern technologies at Gombe like CDs. Was it you, Bill? Yeah. Well, when I was growing up, there was no TV. And lots of kids today can't believe that. There was no TV. I found the books about Tarzan. Everybody knows Tarzan today growing up because they watched TV. And I don't think Johnny Weissmuller had appeared on the British theatre screens at that time. So I read the books. And of course, I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what does he do? He goes and marries that other stupid, wimpy Jane. And I was extremely jealous. And that was when my dream began. I will grow up, I will go to Africa, I will live with animals, I will write books about them. And it seemed utterly impossible. Everybody laughed at me. I was always talking about it, and they would say, why don't you dream about something you can achieve? And it's not surprising. This is now going back to when I was about 11 years old. I was born in 1934, so you can work out the year. And at that time, well, we didn't have any money, as I've said. World War II was raging. Africa was still the dark continent. We really didn't know much about it at all, except from some people who went out as district commissioners and things like that. But the most serious obstacle, the reason everybody laughed at me, is that back then girls simply didn't do that sort of thing. That was, boys could look forward to adventures like that, but girls basically couldn't. And I was always asking at school how I could get to Africa and study animals, and everyone laughed at me, but not my mother. She would say, if you really want something and you work hard and you take advantage of opportunity and you never give up, you will find a way. So this was the wisdom that she imparted into my young life. Well, I didn't go to university when I left school because we couldn't afford it. And I don't know if this was true for Cambridge, but certainly most universities back then, you needed a foreign language to get a scholarship. We couldn't afford it otherwise. So again, it was my mother. She said, do a secretarial course, and then maybe you can get a job in Africa. So that's what I did. I landed up with a job in documentary films, which is incredibly useful for all the hundreds of film teams that I've had to entertain at Gombe ever since. It was actually nothing to do with secretariat. It was great. But then came a letter from a school friend inviting me for a holiday to Kenya, where her parents had just moved. And yes, that was the opportunity. I was working in London. You couldn't save up money in London back then. It's not very hard, not very easy today either, but back then. So I went home, and I worked as a waitress in a hotel around the corner, and finally had enough money for a return fare to Africa by boat, because that was the cheapest in those days. So I was 23, probably quite a lot of you in here are 23 now. And that was when I said goodbye to my family, my friends, and my country, and set off on this amazing adventure. And I like to think of my life as an adventure today. Like every day, you never know who you'll meet, what you'll learn, what you'll encounter. But that first adventure, sailing out, like Dr. Dolittle on his boat to Africa. And we had to go all the way around Cape Town because it was when there was the Suez War and the Suez Canal was closed. I mean, the war with Egypt and the Suez Canal was closed. So a 3-week adventure, seeing flying fish and dolphins and landing in some of these romantic-sounding ports. And then getting to Kenya, and yes, to cut the story short, hearing about Louis Leakey. Somebody said, if you are interested in animals, you should meet Louis. And so going to meet him, well, I'd followed my mother's advice. All those years when I was in London, I'd been learning about Africa, reading books, reading about African animals, spending hours in the Natural History Museum in London. So when I went to see Louis at the museum, he was curator, he asked me questions about all these animals and birds and things, and I could answer a lot of them. And so he gave me a job as his secretary. That's how it began. And one thing led to another, and he allowed me, he said, all right, Jane, you can come on this annual expedition to Olduvai Gorge. Now, Olduvai Gorge, to anyone who's interested in paleontology today, is a very famous place. It's where Zinjanthropus and some other famous fossils were found by the Leakeys. But back then, no human fossil had been found, just the fossilized remains of various animals and some pebbles, which Louis and Mary Leakey were insisting were stone tools, but nobody else believed them. So Olduvai wasn't on the map, and all the animals were there back then. I mean, how lucky is it to have experienced Africa at that time when I was allowed to walk out with Gillian, the one other young girl, after our hard day's work looking for fossils, onto the plains, walking. And there were the antelopes and the giraffe. One evening there was a rhino. One evening there was a young male lion, about 2 years old, with just these little tufts of hair coming off his shoulders, curious like any cat. Never seen anything like me and Gillian before. He followed us much longer than the length of this auditorium, which was a bit scary, but oh, so exciting. And I truly believe that is the day when Louis Leakey decided I was the person he'd been looking for to go and try and learn about chimpanzees. As Robert said, Louis Leakey felt that if we could find behavior that was similar to, or maybe the same, in chimpanzees today and human beings today, that maybe that shared behavior might have been present in a common ancestor about 6 million years ago, and therefore we humans may have brought that characteristic up through evolution with us as part of our genetic heritage. Well, Louis Leakey's theory has held up pretty well. And one of the fascinating things looking back over the 50 years is that chimpanzees are so like us in so many ways. Of course, there's this extraordinary genetic similarity, and now that the genome's been unraveled of humans and chimps, my geneticist friends tell me that the chimps are even more like us than we used to think. It's mainly the expression of the genes which can be influenced by the environment. And the blood is very much the same, and the brain, the structure is almost the same, except that ours is bigger. So not surprising then that there are also all these similarities in intellectual performance, in emotional expression, and in some aspects of behavior, social behavior as well. And that's what's really made so many people so fascinated with the chimpanzee behavior. And it's said always all over the place, well, you know, the Gombe stories are like following a soap opera. The National Geographic coming in and publishing their magazines and making movies and films means that people all over the world have heard about Fifi and Flo and Mike and all the other characters that you students used to try and imitate in your little plays. And so, as I said, I was at Gombe and I was thinking back, and I was thinking about all these tremendously fascinating chimpanzee personalities that I've had the privilege of watching over the years. But I was thinking back to those very early days when it was just me and my mother and the cook Dominic, and how the chimpanzees would take one look at me and disappear into the vegetation because they're very conservative. They hadn't seen a white ape before. And although I was living in my dream world, there I was in this beautiful forest. But I knew if I didn't see something really exciting before the first, the 6 months' money that we'd managed to get, before that ran out, that would be the end of the study. And I would have let Louis Leakey down. And it was very hard for Louis to get the money. It didn't come from an academic institution. How could it? I didn't have a degree. I was kind of straight from England. But he got money from an American businessman for 6 months. And Leighton Wilkie said, well, we'll see how she does. And it was very hard for Louis to get permission from what was then the British administration. It was Tanganyika back then, part of the British colonial empire. And they said, we're not prepared to have a young girl out here on her own. It could be dangerous out in the forest. The animals could be dangerous. That was why my mother came with me. She volunteered, because in the end they said, well, if she has a companion, we'll let her come. So that's why my mother came. And I was thinking about those early days before learning about the chimpanzees and how fascinating they are. And, you know, for me, it was my dream come true, but then I think about my mother. We shared a tent. It was an ex-army tent. Any of you who go camping today, you have these things and you zip them up and this ground sheet is zipped in and it's pretty neat. But this was an old ex-army tent and you rolled up the bottom of the flaps. The ground sheet was not sewn in at all. It was just a piece of canvas on the ground, which meant that all the spiders and bugs and things could walk in if they wished, and they often did, and snakes. And my mother didn't like spiders and she didn't like snakes, but there she was. And I would go up into the mountains in the morning, happy as a sandboy, except I was worried about not seeing the chimps, but I still loved it, and leave her all day on her own with the African cook. Well, that's amazing. And she did this wonderful thing for me. In those days when I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see, and I was getting desperate about, would I be letting Louis Leakey down, she would boost my morale. She would be telling me about what I was learning, how chimpanzees made nests every night, how they move around sometimes in small groups, sometimes by themselves, sometimes small groups meeting up in this fusion fission society, which of course I didn't know anything about a fusion fission society. Remember, I hadn't been to college. And so she was boosting my morale. And it was very sad that this main observation that enabled Louis to get the money from National Geographic happened just after she left. And that was dear old David Greybeard, my favorite chimpanzee of all time, the first who began to lose his fear of me, picking and using pieces of grass as tools to fish for termites, picking a leafy twig and stripping off the leaves, modifying that twig, making a tool. At that time, we were defined as man the toolmaker. It was thought that only humans used and made tools. And so this was something very exciting for Louis with his theory of chimpanzees, helping him to understand how early Stone Age humans might have behaved. And that was what enabled him to get money for us to continue the studies at Gombe. And going back to that time, after we got money from the Geographic, I was sitting up in the mountains one day, and Rashidi, who was one of the wonderful Tanzanian staff at Gombe, he came up the mountain with a letter for me because it was so rare to get a letter. It was pretty exciting. And I can remember opening that letter, and it was from Louis Leakey. It took a very long time to read because if anybody has writing worse than a doctor, it was Louis Leakey. And you had to take a run at it and sort of guess what it meant and then go back and try again. At any rate, I managed to decipher that I would have to stand on my own 2 feet one day. He would not always be around to get money for me. Therefore, I had to get a degree, but there was no time to mess about with a BA, and he got me a place in Cambridge to do a PhD in ethology. What was ethology? I hadn't the faintest idea. There was no email back then. We had to communicate by telegram if we wanted to. Do you know what a telegram is? Some of you don't, I'm sure. And so anyway, that was how I got to Cambridge. And poor Robert was landed with this naive young woman with her pages and pages of longhand descriptions about chimpanzees with no understanding of scientific method. And yes, of course I threw the pages away. You always wrote in red, by the way. So my pages were covered in red. But what was fascinating about the relationship that I had with Robert back then is that, yes, I threw them into the corner and I got mad and I said, yeah, why is it worth going on? I want to be back with the chimps. But then I would think about what he'd written. And there were occasions, Robert, when I probably disagreed with your red notes, but mostly you got through to me, right? And so we had this wonderful relationship where you somehow molded all this knowledge I was acquiring and helped me to understand the scientific method. And one thing that you said then, which I have never forgotten, and I've taught so many of my students, I'd written something frightfully naive about Flo having a new baby, and Fifi, the older sister, was 6 years old and absolutely fascinated and was always close to Flo. She hardly ever left her side. And if another young one came up to try and look at the baby, Fifi would get jealous and chase it away. And you said to me, Jane, you can't say that. You can't prove she was jealous. And I said, well, no, I suppose I can't, but I know she was, so what shall I say? And you said to me, Jane, I suggest you write, Fifi behaved in such a way that had she been a human child, we would say she was jealous. That is brilliant. And I've used that ever since. It stood me in good stead. Robert taught me how to write about my convictions in such a way that I wouldn't be torn apart by other scientists at that time who basically resented this young woman coming in with no credentials and somehow managing to get a PhD at Cambridge. So that was how I got into Cambridge. And thinking back again, as I have been doing so much this year, thinking of the changes at Gombe, we've already, through Richard's eyes and Bill's eyes, and Robert too, seen some of those changes. At first, it was me with a notebook and a pencil and a pair of very old second-hand binoculars because there was so little money when I first went. And I remember the first time I got a little bit of money, I bought a telescope so that I could actually sit on one side of the valley and see what was going on the other, and that was very exciting. And then, of course, the check sheets were introduced. Robert introduced the check sheets. And I think, I'm not sure, but Richard, it may have been you who introduced the maps, or was it Gazer? No, it was Gazer, wasn't it? Introduced the maps. I mean, we were sort of pioneers. There weren't any other studies quite like this. So with this collection of students who somehow heard about Gombe and somehow came and saw me, and we didn't accept all of you. My mother came and interviewed a lot of students, and some of them, she said, no, no, no. At any rate, between us, we kind of devised these methods, and then Robert Hinde and Dave Hamburg came and put a little bit more, order and structure into what we were doing. But everyone had their own ideas, and it really was an exciting time because it was, it was so wide open. And we were so open to ideas from different people, so long as the chimpanzees were not disturbed, or the baboons, or the red colobus. And it really, actually, Tony Collins should have been up on this platform because Tony's been doing the baboons since 1972. He's known as the guru of Gombe. And, he's so much part of Gombe today. He's so much part of this long, long history of Gombe. And what have we discovered? Well, we've discovered all this biological similarity between humans and chimps, but we've also discovered these amazing differences between the personalities of the different chimpanzees, difference in intellectual performance. We've got to learn more and more about these communication postures and gestures, so like ours, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another on the back. A little story here that 3 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., I met the president of the World Bank. And everybody said to me, Jane, I think he may be shy, but he's very stiff. He never looks you in the eye. And nobody can really communicate very closely with him. He does love tigers, and he cares about biodiversity, but he's a very difficult person to interact with. Well, within about 5 minutes, I was teaching Bob Zellick how a chimpanzee greets. I made him be a big, strong male, and I was a subservient female, and he was patting my head, and he totally unbent. And my 10-minute meeting with him turned into an hour, and is going to benefit Gombe hugely, I may say. Not just a truckload of furniture, but cases and cases of lovely dollars. Anyway, so there isn't time to ramble on, but it has been fascinating for me looking back, seeing changes in technology where initially you started with talking about poo, Richard, poo bear and stuff. We used to look through the feces of the chimps to see what they'd been eating. And then it became possible to, still using poo, but to send it off to a lab and do DNA profiling. So for the first time, we now know who the fathers are. And this is really exciting. And also looking at the stress hormones, which we can see through poo, and learning about some of the diseases of the chimpanzees just through examining the poo. So I think all field biologists spend a lot of time messing about with poo. And if you don't like messing about with poo, don't be a field biologist. It won't work. So, okay, learning about all these amazing chimpanzees, all the similarities, using the different technologies as they became available to us, learning which I think is a bit shocking, but that chimpanzees have the chimpanzee version of SIV. We used to think that when they were infected with this SIV, and we do know, by the way, that HIV-1 and HIV-2, which have led to the human AIDS pandemic, have originated from the SIV retrovirus of the chimpanzees in 2 different parts of Africa. And it was a shock to find that the Gombe chimpanzees are infected. And it now seems that when they're infected, they are dying earlier. And there's a lot of work going on now to see how the infection is passed from one to the other. We're now able to use GIS, GPS, and satellite imagery to make amazingly detailed high-resolution maps. And that leads me into the final piece that I want to say this afternoon. As you know, I'm not at Gombe anymore. I visit twice a year just for a few days. Why am I no longer in this place that I love, out there with these chimpanzees, learning from them? Because in 1986, there was a conference in Chicago where for the first time we brought together all the people studying chimpanzees in different parts of Africa. I think there were about 7 studies at that time, something like that. And one by one, they showed slides of what was going on in their particular field study site. And everywhere it was the same picture. There was habitat destruction. There was the beginning of the bushmeat trade. That's the commercial hunting of wild animals for food. And it became increasingly clear as this session on conservation continued that the chimpanzees were losing out. We know now that where there was somewhere between 1 and 2 million 100 years ago across what was an equatorial forest belt right across Africa, now it's not a belt, it's a collection of ever decreasing forest patches. Many chimpanzees are in small fragmented populations, and the maximum number is probably 300,000. Human populations are growing all the time. And it was realizing this and having a session on conditions in some captive situations, seeing chimps in medical research in 5-foot by 5-foot cages and imprisoned basically for life, and they can live to be more than 60 years. What's their crime? Just being so like us that some scientists have felt it convenient to use their bodies to learn more about otherwise uniquely human infectious diseases and search for cures and vaccines. Not wanting to admit that there are these similarities in intellectual ability and emotional expression and response means that to put a being like that in a 5-foot by 5-foot cage with very little enrichment is not an ethically acceptable practice. So that's why I left Gombe. I felt I've gained so much from the chimpanzees, and now it's my turn to try and pay something back. Traveling first in Africa, realizing I was traveling around with a sort of one-man exhibit called Understanding Chimpanzees, going to as many chimpanzee range countries as I could, funded by actually one of the oil companies, Conoco, which was acting in an incredibly responsible way in Congo, Brazzaville. And setting up this exhibit and having a conservation awareness week and trying to get a head of state, if possible, or somebody as high up as we could to open it, and then and for the first time very often, bringing together all the different people involved in conservation in a particular country. I know that was true in Uganda because they all said so. We had sessions where they all came together, and some of them said, well, we didn't know that somebody else was doing what we do, let's do it together. But of course, traveling around Africa like that, I was learning more and more about Africa's problems too. And so many of Africa's problems actually can be traced back to the colonial era. And we know that some of Africa's problems today are still imposed from the outside, sometimes the big multinationals, and sometimes it's just politics. But we are still taking from Africa, taking non-renewable natural resources, and the poverty is increasing, and the old cultures have been destroyed, and there's a vicious cycle of poverty and overpopulation. There are hundreds of thousands of children dying of hunger, and learning more and more and more about the disease and the ethnic violence meant that I felt I had to try and do something about the decreasing chimpanzee habitat, the decreasing numbers of chimpanzees, the problems that were taking their toll on these animal beings who've done so much for me and my students and others who've been working with them. So it became necessary in my mind to also go and travel around and give talks about these things in Europe, in the United States, and then increasingly in Asia, and of course continuing in Africa. That's why I'm 300 days a year on the road. And it's not a pleasant life. It's especially unpleasant after 9/11. You have to go through all this security, take off your shoes, take off your jacket, let me poke you around, let me put you in a glass box and puff air at you. I mean, it's really, oh yes, now they're x-raying our bones all the time now. It's really not fun. But traveling around and talking to people, and then flying over Gombe in 1994 in a small plane, and not just Gombe, but all the area around it, and looking down and seeing, yes, Gombe is still much as it was in 1960, but beyond the tiny 30-square-mile national park, there were no trees left. Not just some deforestation, almost total, with the only trees that you could really see in the very steep ravines where even desperate farmers couldn't cultivate the slopes for food, and women desperate for firewood couldn't go to gather firewood. And it was obvious that there were more people living there than the land could support. It was obvious that the land was losing its fertility from over-farming, terrible erosion. And how could we even try to save the chimpanzees when the people were struggling to survive? And that's what led to our Take Care program, which I won't go into now. It's on our website, the janegoodall.org website. But it's TACARE, Take Care, trying to improve the lives of the people in an environmentally sustainable way, and introducing to them new farming methods most suitable to this very degraded land, and microcredit programs, particularly for women, who can start their own small environmentally sustainable project with a tiny loan. If they pay it back, they can take out a larger loan. Education for the children, our youth program, and better health facilities. And the payoff has come. It took a long time. It was a long time before these villagers began to trust us. We started with 12 villages just immediately around Gombe, and then moved on so that the total was 32 with a grant from the USAID. And it's now required by law for every village to set aside a piece of its land for conservation. That's Tanzanian law. And using the GIS, GPS, satellite imagery, high-resolution maps, we have a wonderful young man, Lilian Pintea. He's from Moldova, or whatever it is. He's trained local Tanzanians, but the team going and sitting with the villagers, and they were so fascinated by their maps. And one lady said, "That's where I put my baby to sleep, under that tree." That's how detailed they are. So because they now trust us and appreciate what we're doing to try to help them to help themselves. That's the secret. They now have agreed, all these villages around Gombe, to put their land in such a way that it forms a buffer. And 5 years after looking out over completely bare hills, I went and looked out over an area where some of the trees were 30 foot high. And I tell you, I was crying, because that's the one hope for the Gombe chimps. And now there's the beginning of a wide corridor of trees where other villagers have put their land aside in such a way that it's making a corridor towards the chimpanzees who still remain in the south. So all around Gombe, we're trying to restore the forest And down in the south, we're trying to protect the forest and the chimpanzees that are still left. And the final piece in this puzzle is that when Sir Nicholas Stern headed up what do you call it, report, well, he came up with a report after a 5-year study of climate change. And one of the conclusions was that the cheapest and most efficient way of slowing down global warming is to protect and restore forests, particularly tropical forests. And so tied in with the cap and trade, where the carbon polluters can actually pay money for their pollution, if that can be used to reduce the emissions of CO2, which come from destroying tropical forests, that's going to make a very big difference. And that gives us some hope of getting some reasonably large sums of money, if it can ever be worked out, to compete, or not perhaps compete, but to give some alternative to an African government who at the present time is selling off its forest mostly to China and other Asian countries. So we from the West, we've done our bit of destruction in Africa, and now Asia is taking over. And if we're not careful, it's going to finish it off. They're not doing any worse than we did. We did it too. So this is why I'm no longer sitting in the forests of Gombe. I wish I were, but it seems to be, since the chimpanzees, since the PhD that I acquired from Cambridge with Robert's help, I could not have got it without him, has given me a voice that people will listen, and I get invited to things like the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit and the new one that's coming up in Durban. I have to put a voice out where, even if it only might be heard, I just have to try and do what I can to do something, not just for the chimpanzees, but going back to the time of Dr. Dolittle when I wanted to speak to the animals. This whole biodiversity, the interrelationship of life forms that we know so little about, but enough to know that just one small species disappearing from an ecosystem can have a ripple effect and end up with ecological collapse. This we mustn't let happen. And so perhaps in the question time, because I know I can't talk anymore now, our youth program, it's called Roots and Shoots. It can involve every single one of you young people here. It's now in 126 countries and it's growing. And it involves people like you in projects that you choose to make the world a better place for people, for animals, for the environment we all share. And why do I spend so much time with youth? Because all of us could kill ourselves trying to save forests and chimpanzees. But if new generations are not going to grow up to be wiser stewards than we've been, we might as well give up. And we won't give up. Thank you.
Good.